I were doing that again, even in the US, I think we would have gotten a good result just by doing kind of like a cutoff approach like you do with sampling producers. You could take a cutoff with routes. You say, look, I'm going to ask you for, maybe you negotiate with the airline, how many prices are they willing to give you? And then you say, okay, can we take the biggest ones, your most popular routes? And I think you'd be absolutely fine. I don't think it's necessary to do a very complicated statistical selection, because generally if you look at an airline and you look at their 6 most popular routes, that's generally going to be quite, I keep using different numbers, 5, 6, 10, because that's a decision that you make in terms of how many items you're going to ask for from the businesses. But I think whatever number you choose or you use should be enough to just take the largest ones. And it's easy to execute too. Remember, when we're trying to make it easy for the businesses, that also makes it easier for the businesses.
Thank you, sir. And the next is, like you say, the challenges of this trick. It's hard to do, you know. Sometimes the airline, also in Indonesia, the airline, in my experience, the airline is, if we take data for how much they have a passenger actually flight, or actually flight not only paid, I think it should take time for them to give us the data. And many consequences if we use this tree, because we have in Indonesia, we have actually CPI, we have a monthly release data, and then make
Uh-oh. I think we're having some problem with the connection there.
Maybe
but,
hello?
Yes, I think I heard enough of your question. We lost the end there, but I can tell you you're exactly right in terms of, you know, choosing the denominator for your unit value. I would never collect a unit value that the company is not calculating themselves. And airlines tend to calculate a lot of different numbers for their own internal analysis of prices. I always would tell my data collectors, like, the company needs to know this more than we need to know this, okay? So that means someone at the company probably knows this data, you know, particularly for the larger companies, because they calculate all kinds of numbers. So if they don't calculate averages internally in our preferred method, then I think we have to look at taking something that's not the preferred method. And I think for every activity, I would say you have certain rules that are the musts, and other rules that are, you know, ideally, I would like to have it with all the free tickets in there, but maybe I'm still willing to get it with just those who paid. To me, that's a reasonable judgment. But I would not take an average price that include multiple routes together. If they said that's all they could provide, I would say, no, I can't take that. That's not going to be a good enough price. So we'll have to look at some kind of direct prices or some other approach, because I'd almost, you know, so with experience, you learn what are the issues that you can compromise with and which ones you cannot. And for me, it mostly came from experience of looking at how these prices behave. But I would not compromise on keeping service as constant as possible. That's going to be the most important aspect of collecting prices. Again, now, if someone said they could give us business and coach together, it's all they could give us, maybe I'd consider it, I'd look at it. But ideally, we know we would want to capture those separately. Okay. not sure about this question about CPI. If someone could clarify that one. I don't have enough information there. If you want to write more or send me an email afterwards, I could take that one. So here's a very good question about in Indonesia, some companies make products based on orders, so that they're producing to order. I would think in many cases, that will be a situation where the same service is not offered under the same terms and conditions in subsequent months. So model pricing is probably going to be your best bet. If they're always making different products to order, model pricing will be the recommended approach. And again, with model pricing, what we do is we select a typical recent transaction. We specify the different components of that transaction, and we hold those components fixed. In future periods, we ask the respondent to give an estimate of what they would charge if they were to get that same order again from a similar type of buyer. Now, again, sometimes companies don't feel comfortable giving us these estimates, so maybe we'd ask them to estimate how much they think it would change. Maybe they say, well, look, I generally for these types of orders, I'm charging 5% more now. Okay, great. Tell us that, and then we'll try to put that into our price index. Model pricing is very challenging. But unfortunately, if the same products are not offered repeatedly in subsequent months, that is going to be our best option, even if it's not a great one. Okay, so another question about the airline example. I think it's tricky to get data that exclude frequent flyer discounts and exclude who don't fly. I agree. We found the same thing. Actually, in my experience, we found it very difficult to exclude those who don't actually fly. So and it wasn't significant enough to cause major changes in the price index, so we didn't really worry about that. The frequent flyer data we were generally able to get because, again, we weren't asking how many frequent flyers. We just asked how many passengers actually got on these flights. And airlines are pretty heavily regulated that they need to know how many people are sitting on these flights, and they generally have good records on that. But again, it'll be specific to this airline you're dealing with. But we found we were able to get that information fairly easily. So if you're not able to get that, I wouldn't choose to make an adjustment for it, right? Because if it's 1% who typically buy the ticket but don't fly, if it's always 1%, you don't need to make an adjustment because it's not going to vary in a way that's going to affect your index. If you're not able to get that data, I would not choose to make an adjustment. I would just move forward with the data you have. I think it's unlikely that you're going to have real sustained price trends that are caused by people purchasing tickets but then not flying. So I just don't think it's that important a factor. I do think, though, what I really wanted to stress was the concept that ideally when you're doing unit value prices, the best denominator is going to include all the services provided, not necessarily all the services that people paid for, right? Because sometimes the more common instance is that you're going to have some customers getting service for free through discounts. You know, think of like a telecom company where your first 3 months are free, maybe. If you agreed to a 1-year contract, maybe you get a month free, something like that. We want to include that in our unit value because that's a real service being offered effectively at a discounted price. Okay. In Indonesia, the government sometimes imposes upper limit tariffs on airlines by considering situations such as holidays. So they'll regulate the amount that the price can increase, okay? And is that a factor in whether you'd consider unit value or direct pricing? Well, I mean, I think it's one factor amongst many, but what you're describing there, where sometimes tariffs, price caps basically get introduced, that could be a situation where, actually, I'm gonna change my answer. That's a hard question as I'm thinking about it. I don't think that factor alone would affect my choice of unit value or direct pricing, because that cap would apply to all buyers, and so I don't think that's really heavily affected by who's buying it, whether you hit the cap or not, and when. That would be something that would be applied across the board. I think for airlines, again, I would recommend going down our flow chart and thinking about those questions there. And again, if budget and respondent burden was not a concern, we would always use direct pricing of repeated services. So you only have to think about going to unit value if you say, well, look, if I only collect 5 to 10 ticket prices for the airline, I'm not really reflecting all the activity, and I'm not really capturing how their net revenue they receive for providing fixed quality services is changing. Okay, so by default, I start with direct prices of repeated services, and then I go to unit values if I feel like I'm not able to collect enough data with direct pricing. Okay, how about producers who charge fees like leasing equipment? So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about different kinds of rentals coming up in the next part of the lecture. We generally do, the types of prices that I described can be used for any situation. So you could consider having a unit value for leases. You could, again, all that matters is that you keep the quality of the service as constant as possible. So it's always the same equipment being leased for a fixed unit of measure, meaning like, per day or something, that they actually charge per an increment of service provision. But hopefully I'll get leases are very challenging in many situations, but if it's just a straightforward rental of equipment for a day, I think generally we typically would use direct pricing of repeated services there, because companies may not, it depends on how many products they lease out and whether there's very different prices charged to different customers based on who's buying it and when. If the answers were yes to those questions, I would consider a unit value, but I would then need to figure out what's my unit of measure for my denominator, and that all could be done. All right, telecommunications or entertainment, such as Spotify and Netflix, that usually offer certain periods of subscriptions with variety prices. Would you like to give an example of how to calculate the indexes, especially annual subscriptions that always give some extra discounts? Yeah, so this is common with a lot of these subscription packages. Now, I have to go back and think back a little bit. If we would accept a price that was the average revenue received for all monthly subscribers who are subscribed to the plan in the current period, divided by the number of those subscribers. So then if you have someone who's getting something free for a period, that would be reflected in your unit value. And then later on, when they're paying maybe a higher price or something else, that's also reflected in your unit value. Okay, the good thing about the unit value is it's representing all the customers who are currently receiving service, including those who came on at a rate that was offered 3 months ago and 4 months ago and 6 months ago. And that's a positive, right? Because that affects the revenue that the producer is receiving. If you think about the PPI as a deflator of nominal revenue, right? If companies are receiving revenue largely based on contracts they entered into 6 months ago, then we want our deflator to also reflect that group of transactions. So you can do things like taking unit values of how much revenue are they bringing in for the subscriptions divided by the number of active subscriptions. Now, in terms of if someone has an annual agreement, based on the accrual principle, they need to accrue that out, those charges out to each month. Okay, they can't, if someone's paying 200 for a year, they have to convert that into a monthly figure, which then is included in the average each month that subscription is active. And typically, companies will do that kind of accounting themselves. Companies like Netflix do that because it helps them analyze exactly, how much net revenue they're receiving each month. But that kind of adjustment is necessary. We don't want to just take annual payments and mix them in with monthly payments. It has to be all on the same basis. If our unit of measure reference is a month, all the transactions have to be on a monthly basis. You can't mix monthly and annual. Okay, but it's important to note, some of those annual subscribers, if their rates are accrued or kind of split between the 12 months, now they can be included. And again, that's how companies tend to do these calculations as well. Okay, why don't we move on to the next part of the lecture?
Yes, maybe we can move on to the next topic.
I'm behind schedule again?
Not really.
Okay, you gotta, let me go back here. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to continue talking about different topics related to services prices. And a couple topics I want to hit on are prices based on labor rates, percentage fees, and composite services and price bundles. So there are many different types of services prices, but they're all going to be composed of combinations of the methods we just discussed earlier today. Direct pricing of repeated services, unit value prices, model prices, and list prices. But we can combine these approaches in different ways, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this next part. So for example, prices based on labor rates. This is frequently observed in activities classified in I6 Section M, professional, scientific, and technical activities, and I6 Section N, administrative and support service activities. Prices are billed as a combination of charged labor rates for the staff that worked on a specified project in the pricing period. So here's an example of prices based on labor rates. Sure, okay. So here I have an example of a management consulting company. Accounting companies, legal companies, they often work similar. And what I've done here is I've selected a recent transaction. Okay, so this is a management consulting company providing advice to a small retail client on selecting sites for expansion. And the service that I've selected here includes research and the delivery of a customized report and 3 in-person meetings with the client. For that contract, a partner will bill 20 hours at a rate of $200 per hour. An associate will bill 60 hours at a rate of $125 per hour. And then continuing on with the junior associate and the support staff. Then the final price is the total of the rate per hour times the number of hours for each of the professionals that bill their time for this service. It's important to note the labor rates used in the calculation need to be billed rates. What is the client actually paying, which is not the same as these individuals' actual wage rates, because they apply overheads and other things involved there. Okay. Now, since the consulting company will not produce this same custom report in repeated periods, model pricing is the optimal choice of what we're going to have to do here. With a model price, we select a real transaction in the initial collection period. Then we ask the respondent to estimate the price that would be charged if the same service were to be provided to a similar client in future periods. These estimates will be based almost entirely on the current hourly charge rates for the professionals that worked on the project. Now, for these hourly rates charged for each staff member, there may be cases where unit values are an appropriate option. So we would go through our flow chart to help us determine that. And the key one here is usually the price variability factor. Are prices charged for the same services highly variable based on who is buying the service and when? And again, if yes, and the mix of buyer types is relatively stable from period to period, then we would consider getting not the partner rate that was billed to this specific client, but maybe the unit value of all the partner rates they charged for an hour of service to all clients. So to execute this strategy, which is really mixing the model price approach with the unit value approach, what we do is we select a recent transaction to configure the model. Okay, so we collected that transaction which said to accomplish the service, the partner billed 20 hours, the associate billed 60 hours, the junior associate 90, etc. So we take that recent transaction to tell us which staff should be included in our transaction price and the number of hours for each of those staff members. But the rate that we include in the calculation now would not be the billed rate for one specific client, but the unit value of the hourly rates that these professionals charge for all clients. Again, and we do that if the prices charged for different customers vary a lot based on who is buying the service and when. Okay, so now I take those unit values for those professionals, multiply it by the hours that are fixed from my model, and I get my price. The staff members and the number of hours for each staff member should remain fixed unless the company indicates that the same quality of output is produced with a different mix of staff time. This typically happens due to changes in the company's productivity, often associated with technology change. But in practice, it's often difficult for companies to report those kinds of changes. Okay, so let me show you what I'm describing there. Let's say in period 2, the company begins using an automated software program to format, design, and organize the final report. Previously, the support staff performed this task, but now with the new software, the junior associate can do it themselves in 2 hours. But the product that the customer gets is still exactly the same. It's just now they can produce it using fewer staff hours. If the company were to pass those savings on to the client, the staff hours should be adjusted, resulting in a price decline. right? Because if the company is able to provide the same quality of final service and they charge less for it, we need to show that as a price decline. Okay, so now, after the technology is introduced, we no longer need the support staff at 20 hours. They completely eliminated. And now the junior associate has to build 2 additional hours for them to run this software and put the report together. And here we have a result that results in a price decline. Now, again, this rarely is reported in practice. Companies often can't tell us about these changes that happen. I personally don't know when I become a little more productive and when I become a little less productive. I find that very difficult to measure, and I think most professionals do as well. But I think what's important here is the theory involved. Generally, we want the professionals and the hours they work to remain fixed in a model. The only situation in which we would change it is if there's some technological change that lets them produce the same output with a different number of inputs. If the consulting company next month provided a different service to this same client, so they would say maybe for that different service, they have different professionals working different numbers of hours, we don't want that. We don't want to track that with our price. We're using that initial service just to fix the model. The next month, we still want them to give us the price that would be charged for advising that same small retail client on selecting sites for expansion. And really, all they typically need to do is tell us the updated build rates for the professionals that charged for the project. So an advantage of that model price is it allows us to capture the productivity-driven price change that I just described. It would not be possible to capture that change if all we collected was the standard rate for a single hour of a staff member's time. If we were to say that the price of this service was $200 an hour and our unit of measure was an hour, we would never be able to show the kind of productivity-driven price change that we were able to show with the model. Okay. The model also indirectly increases the number of service varieties included in the index, since now we were pricing the rates for 4 different professionals rather than just 1. So list prices for billed labor rates should be collected only when it is not possible to use a model. Okay, so I know that's not very relevant for you now. You're going to move on to professional and scientific and technical services in a couple years when you move on to those activities. Maybe you could refer back to this presentation or send me an email when you're ready to work on those activities, and we can discuss those ideas in more detail when you're ready to work on those activities. Okay, another type of price that we see a lot in services activities is percentage fees. So these are services where the prices are charged as a percentage of the value of an underlying good or asset. Often observed in activities where a company acts as an agent to facilitate transactions. Some examples are security and commodity contract brokerage, insurance agents and brokers, real estate agents, maybe travel agents. And I'll show you an example of what this looks like. My example here is a real estate agent. Again, I know this service is transacted differently in different countries. I'm not sure how the market works in Indonesia, but in the United States, I can tell you that the way the agents receive their revenue is that they charge a percentage of the selling price of a home when they assist with the sale. So here we have an example where a real estate agent is assisting with the sale of a 3-bedroom home. We specify the city, we specify the neighborhood, we specify different characteristics about the home. Here we have the square meters, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and when the home was built. The home sells for 800,000 baht. The real estate agent takes a 2% commission, so their price is 800,000 times 2% or 16,000 baht. That's what a transaction would look like. Now again, since that agent is not going to sell that same home each month or each quarter, we're going to have to use a model price. When we use a model price, we select a recent real transaction, and that in future periods, the respondent provides the price that would be charged if they were to provide the same service by assisting with the sale of the same property. Okay, so the next period we ask, okay, if you were to have sold that house again, what would have been the value of that house and what commission would you charge? Right? Two separate questions there. What percentage commission would you charge? And what would be the value of that home if it were to be sold again in each subsequent period? Now, in terms of the commission, the respondent can typically make an estimate of this value since they don't really change those commission rates that often. Generally, in our experience, they basically are fixed. You could use a unit value for the percentage rate, but in most cases, there's not a lot of variability there. The hard part is estimating the value of the home that was transacted, because that requires knowledge of the specific market in which the home was sold. And respondents frequently have difficulty providing estimates of those values. So here's an example, just to kind of illustrate some of the concepts with percentage fees. Let's say all real estate agents in Thailand are priced as a percentage fee of property transaction prices. In 2018, there were 10 million properties transacted across the country. There were 1 million agents employed who assisted with all of those transactions. On average, they charge 2% commission. Okay, and that's true in both 2018 and 2019. Same number of properties transacted, same number of agents who were working in the field, and the same percentage fee charged. However, let's say Thailand had a total housing boom, and the average property value in constant quality, meaning that the very same house in the following year now is worth twice as much as it was in the prior year. Okay, just an extreme example to show the concept. So the average home was worth 500,000 baht in 2018, and then in 2019, suddenly it's worth $1 million. So let's think about what would happen in the national accounts in this situation. Regardless of the price index used, the nominal value of sales the real estate agents actually receive is going to be the number of transactions times the percentage fee times the property value, right? Because for the average property value, they take a percentage of it, and then it's just how many times are they helping with sales. Okay, so the total nominal output is going to equal the calculations at the top of this slide. However, let's say we did not think about the value of the home in our PPI. We said, look, the agents sell, they charge 2%. They charged 2% in 2018, they charged 2% in 2019. So the price is the same, right? They've not changed their price. If we were to say that, our deflator would be 1. Okay, no change in price. If, however, we include the value of the good or asset in our price, Now, the price deflator would be 0.5, right? Because the price doubled. The home value doubled, so the price doubled. All right, so now the deflator will be 0.5, meaning I'll show you how that works here on this next slide. Okay, so if we were to look at percentage fees only, our price deflator would be 1, right? There'd be no change in the price index, but nominal output would double. That means that real output would then double, right? Because you take nominal output, divide it by your deflator to get real output. So that would mean that the productivity data for Thailand would show that each agent was now twice as productive, right? Because they received twice as much revenue for providing the same amount of labor inputs. So they were twice as productive. If we include the value of the asset in our price index, now we would deflate the increase in nominal output that's coming from increased home value. And we would show that each agent, there was no change in the productivity, because remember, each agent sold the same number of homes in 2019. We go back to this example here, right? They're the same number of agents transacting the same number of homes. All that's changed is that the homes are now more valuable. I would argue that the agents were not really twice as productive. So therefore, we should be including the value of the good or asset in our PPI deflator. And that just shows the concept of why we choose to include it. Okay. Now, we mentioned that it's very hard for respondents to update the value of the good or the asset. In some cases, we found that sometimes we had better information than the company did. So let's say, for example, the central bank calculates a constant quality home price index for the Bangkok area. You may choose to ask the respondent to just update their percentage fee, and then you would apply this data to property values adjusted by the Bank of Thailand index. I don't know if you have a residential property pricing index in Indonesia. In many countries, these indexes are calculated by the central bank. Sometimes they're done by the statistical office. But if you have that data, you might want to use it. Okay. And a significant advantage of this approach is that you don't need to have a representative sample of properties across the country in the PPI, which is very, very hard to do, particularly in a big, diverse country like Indonesia. Okay, so here's an example of how that would look. Let's say the central bank has a home price index that rises 10% from period 1 to period 2. There's no change in the percentage commission, which is very common. They don't really change a lot. So all the respondent would see is percentage commission, they'll mark no change. However, then you could take that information and adjust it based on a home value that's adjusted with the central bank property price index. Because that increased 10%, we'll say that the home value now has increased by 10% from 800,000 to 880,000, and our price will increase. It's a big advantage if you can get this kind of data from another price index or from maybe a third-party data source rather than from the companies directly. But remember, constant quality is key. So let's say you were to get, sometimes you find data that's the average home price in Jakarta. That's really not a good price index for this purpose, because that price index will change as different types of properties are sold. You have changes in mix of properties. A good residential property price index looks at what the same quality of price would sell for. Just one other thing to note for these kinds of transactions. Age is often a quality characteristic. It's generally good practice not to specify the year in which, for example, the home was built, but to reference it relative to when the sale occurred. Right, so here I don't say it was built in 2014, I say it was built 5 years before it was sold. The reason why I do that is that next year, I would now, to maintain constant quality, now I'm pricing a different house. I'm pricing a house that was actually built in 2015 in the following year. Okay, it's still 5 years before the sale. That keeps the concept of quality constant. Really just bring this up as an interesting example of how we have to think about quality sometimes with complex services. All right, finally, composite services and price bundles. Let me define these two phrases. A composite service is a primary service combined with a secondary service that would not otherwise be available without the purchase of the primary service. So an example is a hotel that offers accommodation with housekeeping. You cannot just get the housekeeping without renting the room. You cannot get that secondary service without the primary service. Another example would be in telecommunications. Let's say a service that is caller identification. You know, something that tells you who is the person who's calling you when they dial. You cannot buy that service if you don't have the phone line from the telecommunications provider. So that's a composite service. The secondary service is only available if you purchase the first one. A price bundle, on the other hand, is a combination of independent services that are available separately but could be priced together. An example would be, again, in a hotel, if they offer you free breakfast. Well, you know, maybe people who are not staying in the hotel could also buy breakfast. They could come in and purchase breakfast. So that makes that a price bundle as opposed to a composite service. If it's only people who stay in the hotel who can access the restaurant, then the meal would be a composite service. But because people who don't stay at the hotel can buy it, it's a price bundle. Internet and subscription television is often a price bundle, right? They're available separately, but they will offer it for a special price as part of a bundle. So the general rule here is that the composite services are priced as a single product altogether. But for the price bundle, the treatment may vary depending on if the bundle appears in the product classification. Okay, so you know, bundles are hard. So the first question you always want to think about is this really a bundle or is it a composite service? Because if it's a composite service, you're just going to price it all together and not worry about it. But if it's a real bundle, meaning that the services are available for separate purchase, but they're offered together, then you ask, does the product classification include separate products for the services bundled together and apart? If yes, then you want to price the bundle together, right? Your product classification includes a product that covers the bundled situation. If no, then you could either partition the bundle if the discounted prices of the components are available separately, or price the bundle as a single service classified based on its largest component. Okay, so the classic example of bundles is telecommunications. Phone service and television programming services and streaming and internet and all together. So in the US, the product classification system now includes a product for bundled telecom. Because it's so common, it actually appears in the product classification. I don't know whether it appears in the central product classification. I forgot to check. If it doesn't now, it probably will in the future. I don't know if you have a product classification that you use in Indonesia and whether you'd have to look, does that bundle exist there? If it doesn't, then your question is, are the prices for the bundle, can they be split up? Can the telecom company tell you, yes, we offer a bundle of telephone, internet, and programming, but I can tell you that in our internal systems, we allocate different prices to those three components, so we can split it up and price it separately. If they cannot give you those separate components, then you're going to have to price the bundle together and classify it in either internet, programming, or telephone based on which one is the biggest part of the bundle. When bundling becomes so common, like in telecom, I really think your best option is to have a separate category for the bundled service and then different categories for these services when sold separately outside of a bundle. Okay? But if you don't have that situation, here are the choices you can make. Okay? So I'm going to pause here again for some questions, and then if there are any, and if not, then I'll
maybe
move on
we can move on to the next topic first, and
Okay.
then after that we have a discussion.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to go back to sharing. Okay, next we'll talk about data collection, which I know will be important to many of you. All right. Well, we'll do the discussion afterwards because I know some things about how you collect prices, but there's a lot more. I'm curious to hear what your procedures are at BPS. I could say generally, it's strongly recommended that respondent initiation for services PPI be executed by data collectors who've been trained on PPI procedures for the specific activity. And if the in-person visit is not feasible, video conferencing or telephone collection are also great. As a matter of fact, I would even change this now to say, look, video conference, telephone, it's working for this course. I would say it would work absolutely great for bringing a new company into the PPI. Sometimes the companies actually prefer that. Okay, so when we talk about data collection, I'm going to describe two different steps. The respondent initiation, the first time we bring a company into the PPI, and what we call the subsequent pricing periods, which is typically simpler. And we may not even need a data collector to get the data. Maybe they can just provide it by mail or online or by telephone, whatever it is. But it's that first initiation visit that's the most difficult step. Because first of all, we have to convince them to participate in the index. We need to try to collect weighting information, which I'll talk about. We need to select which items we're going to include in the price index. We need to collect all the specifications for those items that we select. And we need to get the first price that we'll use in the index. Plus, we have to tell the respondent how they're going to provide price updates. Again, whether they do it online, whether someone visits them, whether they do it by phone. So that's a lot of things to get done in that initial visit. That initial visit is a very, very challenging part of PPI compilation. So generally, the recommended practice is to communicate first through mail, because businesses would pay attention if something comes in an important envelope that says it's labeled important from the government. You know, in the US, we had different classes of mail, and we would pay for the higher class of mail to draw more attention to the letter when it comes. And the letter would notify the company that they've been selected for the PPI, would provide some information about the PPI and why it's important. Again, I talked yesterday about that if we can get statements of support from senior government officials or industry associations, we found that those were very helpful. If we're going to collect, let's say, telecom companies, if we had a letter from the Telecom Association of Indonesia, that might help convince companies that this is something that their representative group supports. Okay, and the communication should include an explanation of next steps and a description of the information that will be needed for the initiation process. We talked a lot earlier today about statistical units. So the collection procedures are going to vary depending on what your sample unit is. Are you collecting an entire establishment? Only a single establishment, or an entire enterprise, or a kind of activity unit? The data collector needs to know that, right? Because that's going to drive the questions they ask and the answers that they want to get, right? That determines which products are eligible to be collected as part of the unit. It affects the weighting information we want to collect for the unit. Okay, if you're collecting an enterprise or establishment, we might need to determine the activity classification of the unit, right? We might think that a company produces wireless telecommunications, but then we get there and we find out, no, they actually do wired telecommunications. Okay, so the data collector would have to get that information if we're using an enterprise or an establishment. So I've talked before about how I think it's a good practice to collect total unit sales for the most recent completed year as the basis of the item weights we collect from the company. It's also a good practice to collect a second size measure that is likely to be correlated with sales. Okay, again, I think it's good if you could do it. It's not always mandatory, but this is a good practice. And the reason why you do that is that you can then use this data to estimate weights for companies that don't provide sales. So ideally, this measure should also exist in the sampling frame. So the standard second size measure is employment. However, it could also be an activity-specific measure, such as number of paid subscribers for a telecommunications company, or another measure for a different activity you might cover. Now, let me explain why we try to collect this. If a company tells me their total revenue and their total employment, that's great. Now, if I visit a company that says, look, I can tell you the number of employees, but I don't want to tell you my sales. It's confidential, I don't want to tell you. I can then estimate their sales based on the ratio of revenue to employee from the companies that told me both sets of data. Okay, so that's why we collect a second size measure. It's useful for estimating revenue for companies that won't give it to us. Now, there's no rule for how many items you collect from each unit. Sometimes you might choose to vary the number of items. So bigger companies, you'll collect more items, and smaller companies, less items. You know, there's a lot of factors that might influence the number of items you collect. I would also say the type of price collected plays a role here. If you're collecting unit values, you know, you're including more transactions in a single price. So you probably need to collect less items than if you were to collect direct prices of repeated services. You know, think about that for airlines, right? One price could reflect all the transactions for all the flights from Jakarta to Hong Kong. Now, I still might need more than one item, right? Because they fly multiple routes and I'd want to collect multiple routes. But if I were just having a price that reflected an individual seat sold to a particular type of buyer who buys it at a particular time, whether it's a week before the flight or 2 months before the flight, and I need to know if they're getting a special rate based on if they're a business traveler or whatever, if they, whether the ticket is cancelable or not. That just means now I'm going to need a lot more items to collect if I'm using direct prices of repeated services to reflect all these different services that the airline offers. So a good practice is to provide a list of the most important products offered by the company, offered by companies that are classified in the collected activity. So, if you use the central product classification or a national product classification that's based on CPC, this would be what you'd use here. These are CPC product categories here for wired telecommunications. These are kind of outdated, but these is carrier services, fixed telephony, internet, all other. That's just what happens to be in the product classification. So I could choose to use those to figure out the company's sales and then their sales by product. This is a perfect world where a company would tell you, I earned $1 billion in sales last year, and 50% of that came from this service line, and 30% came from that service line, and 10 from the other, right? Maybe they'll tell you the actual numbers, maybe they'll tell you percentages, who knows? Maybe they have this data in their annual report and they give you their annual report and they say, look, you can find it there. Often they won't tell you this. They won't give you all the detailed sales by product. You could ask them to estimate it. That works well too. Say, hey, look, it's not important I know exactly how much, but can you estimate, is it about 50, 20? That can be helpful as well. Now, we had the question earlier about selecting items. There are many ways to select items. I'm going to show you the long, complicated way, because this is what we would tend to use in the United States if we were able to collect this data. I kind of don't want to go into this in tremendous detail because I'm not convinced that it's always the best option as the way to go, and there's a lot of quirks to it. But I think the important thing to know is that if you can, you want to know the total sales and then the proportion of their sales by major product category. And then you can assign items to those product categories. I think very often they'll just tell you, look, this is my biggest product category, this is my second, this is my third, this is my fourth. We can use that information, okay? We don't always need these very precise percentages. These slides walk through how you could use a random number table to make a statistical selection of items. I think in the interest of time, I kind of don't want to go through this in detail because I'm not sure. I'm guessing you don't use this approach now. Is that correct? So I think the idea is more important than the detail here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this. If anyone's interested, I could stay afterwards and talk through it. But basically what we do is we take the percentage of sales for each product category to help us determine how many items we take from each bucket. Okay. Then we say, look, 50% of the company sales come from this category. I have this many items in this category, and then I can just split the percentage of sales by the number of items. And then we get something we call the item weight share. Okay, for this company, we determined that we were going to collect 8 items. We made that number up. We said we want to get 8 items. Based on their sales by product category, we determined we're going to collect 3 items in the carrier services category, 2 in fixed telephony, 2 in internet, and 1 in other. I think you would be absolutely fine if you say, look, I'm just going to take 2 products from each of their 3 biggest categories. Simple, easier, no random numbers. I think that would be absolutely fine. The thing I would encourage you to do, though, is collect the total sales for the company and allocate it to the categories. Even if you say, look, I'll just put most of the weight in the biggest category, and then the second most weight in the second category, and then the third in the third. We want to get some kind of estimated item weight that is based on the total company sales and the share of the company sales that comes from the product category in which the item is classified. So here you can say all my carrier items are getting a weight of 166.7 million. My fixed telephony are getting 50 million. My internet are getting 175 million. Again, I want to stress here, you do not need to do this in the very precise calculation way that I've done on these slides. You can simply say, 50% of the sales come from the biggest category, and I'm going to collect 2 items in that category. So 25% of the total company sales get allocated to each of those 2 items. Really, what the important thing is that we're taking the total company sales and allocating it to the different items we collect as item weights. Here's an example of how you could do that with ranked categories. If you have 4 categories and they rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, here internet services is number 2, you can say default shares, they get 40, 30, 20, 10%. That adds to 100. And you could find different default shares depending on the number of categories you have. I think that is completely acceptable as an approach. It's probably not worth the effort to go through the very precise selection process that is shown on those previous slides with the random number table. I think if you just use this kind of ranking approach with equal weights amongst all the items within the categories, I think you would be doing great. Okay. I'm going to skip over all the selection process. Okay. I wish I had changed, I regret not changing this example to just make it simpler. Let's say we had 40, 30, 20, 10. We have 2 items in each category. Then we'll just take the shares and divide it by the equal number of items in each category. That would be a totally great way to do this. Then we wouldn't have 3 items in that first category. We'd only have 2, so it would be 20% for each of the 2 items, 10% for each of the items in fixed telephony, because remember, this was ranked 3rd, so it only got a 20% share, and 15% for each of the 2 items in internet. Okay. I would encourage you, if you choose to collect company sales as item weights, so that you could use weighted elementary index calculations, which we're going to talk about when we get to index calculation, I would say keep it simple. Just try to get estimate shares for the product categories, assign equal numbers to each one, and now you have item weights. When you're selecting items within the product categories, aim for services with significant sales that are likely to be transacted regularly in the future. Okay, so that might be, in the case of airlines, maybe our categories would be international flights and domestic flights. Those would be our 2 product categories. And then within the category, we'll just try to choose very common routes. We can ask for the biggest routes in each category. And that's how we'll select our items within the product categories. A note on bundling. Bundling is one of these thorny issues that keeps coming up. Again, if the product classification has provided a separate category for bundled services, then our list would look like this. We would have bundled telecom as a category, And then the other categories would exist only for services that are offered outside of bundles. If you don't have that category for bundled services, then you're either going to need to separate them into the different product categories if the company can give you prices for the components, or you're going to have to take all the bundled services and put it in one of these categories based on which one is most of the service. Okay. Specifying the collected items. The amount of detailed specifications needed for constant quality pricing will depend on the service and the type of price you are collecting. For example, if you are using unit value pricing for passenger air transportation services, you're not going to need a lot of characteristics. All you're going to need to know is the origin and destination and the class of service. However, if you're using direct pricing, now I'm going to need to know more. I need to know what kind of customer is it? What type of ticket are they purchasing? Is it round trip or one way? What are the cancellation policies on the ticket? And how many days in advance of the flight are they purchasing it? So that's a lot more characteristics I need to collect if I'm doing direct pricing for repeated services for an airline ticket. I have an example here from the US questionnaires. This one is for hotels. Just to kind of walk through one example, regardless of the type of price collected, we always specified some basic information about the property. Okay. Where is the property? What kind of hotel is it? We had different categories where limited service, where it had no restaurant, and then a full service, which does have a restaurant, a luxury, which has 24-hour room service and concierge. We'd want to know some characteristics about the property. Then we'd also want to know, does it have a pool? Does it have 24-hour room service? You know, what are these key characteristics of the property? And we would collect that because if the hotel were to be renovated, we might need to make a quality adjustment. Because if the quality of the room improved and prices increased significantly, that really wouldn't be, you know, constant quality pricing. So we might need to make an adjustment there. Or if we're not able to make an adjustment, just link out any price change between the pre-renovation and the post-renovation. Now, if we were to collect a unit value, we wouldn't need to know much about the rooms. We would simply say, is it suites or non-suites? That's typically all the difference we would do for hotel rooms. That's kind of similar to the business class versus economy class on an airline. We would have separate averages for those. And then we would just need to know, you know, what was the period covered by the unit value. And then we would say, tell me your total revenue that you received for all rooms booked during this period. And then we would divide it by a denominator. Maybe I can ask you to think about this. If you were to use a unit value for hotels, what do you think would be the best denominator? Here are some choices. The number of rooms, the number of rooms that were occupied, the number of guests, or the number of room nights occupied. Okay, so let's say I'm looking at the average price for all the rooms in a hotel. I could take the total revenue divided by the number of rooms. That's not going to be a good option, right? Because then empty rooms will be included in our unit value. We don't like that. A is definitely bad. We don't want number A. Number of rooms occupied. Okay, well, but you know, the same room could be occupied some nights, but not all nights, right? So it's hard to say how many rooms are occupied because maybe all the rooms will be occupied on one night, but then half of them will be empty on the next night. And we're not taking an average per night, we're taking an average per all the nights of the month. So the rooms occupied is really hard to make that work practically because we need some other measure. The number of guests, no, that's not good because, you know, most hotels don't charge based on number of guests. Some might, but generally it's going to be based on rooms. The best denominator that we found was room nights occupied. That means if we were looking at the total revenue the hotel took in for the month, we would divide it by the total number of room nights. So that means if one room was occupied all 30 nights in a month, it would get counted as 30 room nights. If another room was only occupied 20 nights within the month, it would be counted as 20 room nights. You total up all those room nights, and that gets you the denominator that we would use in our unit value. Okay, and that also, by the way, includes rooms provided for free. Because we're looking at room nights occupied, not number of people who paid. Okay, so that's what we would use for a denominator for unit value for hotels. A note about bundling with hotels. Bundling a food and beverage service is often a problem with hotels. If food and beverage service is available to non-guests, then the inclusion of food represents a price bundle. And you could either separate the price associated with the food and beverage, or you can include it together. If you're going to include them both together, then the transaction is classified as accommodation because that's the larger part of the bundle. If it's not separated, it's advisable to collect and specify separate unit values for accommodation service with food and accommodation service without food, if you can. So as I mentioned, if you're not using a unit value, now we need to know more characteristics about the room and the buyer and what they bought and a lot of information. I need to know something about who the buyer is. You know, often hotels, particularly in a business hotel that caters to business guests, different business groups get different special rates. So I want to know, you know, who's the buyer, what kind of rate did they get, what's the date. We would either get the rate for a Tuesday or a Saturday to kind of represent weekdays and weekends. I need to know what kind of room, how many beds are in the room, any features about the room, what does it include, so that I can try to keep all those constant with a direct pricing of repeated services. All right, collecting the initial price. We need to specify the type of price collected. Is it a unit value? Is it a direct price of repeated services? Is it a model price? We need to specify the unit of measure. Right, so that would be the denominator if it's a unit value, but also just transaction prices often have different unit of measures for different services activities. If it's not transacted in domestic currency, you want to note the alternative currency used. This is more important in some countries than others. And you want to specify the time period covered. So usually collecting the initial price is simple, but for particular activities, it can be really complicated. And where it's complicated, we need to train the data collectors on the procedures. You know, even an example like I gave earlier, where I was talking about a real estate agent, we need to train the data collectors to tell the business that they have to collect a recent home sale and that we understand in subsequent periods that they're not going to sell that same home, but still we want them to estimate the commission they would charge. The data collector has to do a lot of that work. So there's a lot that needs to get done in that initiation visit. You know, again, they would need to execute the selection of items. Usually. Now, maybe sometimes you might be able to do that in the headquarters office and then pre-select the items that are then going to be collected. but in most cases, it is the data collector that executes that. So as we get started here with discussion, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how does data collection work for your SPPIs now? How do you do the initial visit? And then how do you collect prices for all the subsequent periods after that initial visit? Can someone share with me information about that? Oops, I'm gonna try to stop sharing.
Langsung gue. Okay, about your question, in BPS in Indonesia, generally, for PPI for A, B, and C category, we have a personal visit from provincial and then provincial to the regency. We have a field enumerator, but because of the budget constraint, until now we don't have training for the field official. And then for the SPPI, for the transportation for the passenger transportation, I'm sorry, what is your question? Putus cuy. Sorry. Ini gue.
Sorry, Andrew, maybe you need to unmute first.
Andrew, we cannot hear you. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I always do that. So for the SPPIs, the provincial offices go to, do they do a personal visit with the company when they first bring a company into the SPPI? And then after that initial collection, how is the subsequent price collection? Is it done by mail? Does the data collector go back and visit the company again? Is it over the phone? Can companies provide prices online?
For SPPI, for initial price, actually we have in the headquarter office, we have initial price study in depth to research what is the price for that we have to collect, and then after we have decide what kind of variable that we have to collect, and then we have we build a questionnaire form for the establishment, and then for some area like the passenger transport, it's directly from the provider for the airline email to us.
Did you say the profiler?
Provider, the airline.
Provider, yes.
And for the accommodation, especially for the short-term accommodation, it's collected by the field enumerator in BPS Regency, and we divide for the short-term accommodation is 1 star, 2 star until 5 star, and no star hotel, and then for the calculating we aggregate them for the short-term accommodation.
So you tell the provinces that they should collect. Do you tell them which hotels to collect, or do you tell them just get a certain number of 5 stars, some 2 star, some 1 star?
Especially is depend on the provincial. We ask them to collect what is the biggest share in that province, is maybe 5 star or 4 star for the share in the provincial. And for the constant quality, the enumerator should ask about the what type of room that the biggest share for the hotel, just maybe deluxe room or the junior rooms like that.
So how about the do you select a national sample of properties, or do you just, or do you have the regions select their own individual samples based on activity in those regions or provinces, excuse me?
For the accommodation?
Yep, for accommodation and maybe for other services as well.
And for accommodation, it's depend on the provincial.
How about for something like telecommunications?
For telecommunication, we have three biggest provider in Indonesia. It's especially for the wireless. It's Telkomsel, XL, and Indosat. It's about 84% for the share for national. So, like Busri said before, it's only one that fill our questionnaire. It's Indosat. It's about 14%. I think it's not enough to build the index for the wireless telecommunication.
So were the provincial offices involved in that collection, or was that handled by headquarters?
Yeah, provincial, especially for the Jakarta BPS officer. But for the initial price, the headquarter.
Okay. And you said you do have different questionnaires for different types of activities, like the questionnaire for hotels would look different than the questionnaire for transportation?
Yeah.
Great. So that's one of the steps as we develop new activities, right? We have to develop a new questionnaire.
Yeah.
Great.
For the new SPPI, we have to go to in-depth study. So we have to know what kind of price that we have to collect.
Great. Well, yes, the in-depth study is very important. Maybe we could share some materials that might help as well to help that study. But so the procedures I've described kind of start from a place of drawing a national sample of companies that are then allocated out to the provinces to collect. Again, if your sampling frames, like for example, you talked about using the data from the government agencies for transportation and for telecommunications. Are those national company lists, or are those separate lists by province?
For telecommunications, it's national, but for the transportation, it's provided by the provincial level, provincial government officer.
Are all provinces working from the same national list?
Yeah.
Okay. But again, it's not the case that you select the hotels in the headquarters office. The provinces can select different hotels, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. It's always different in different countries, so it gives me context to understand. So how, in the provinces, are there specific enumerators that would be assigned for collecting specific service activities?
Sorry, Andrew, can you repeat your questions?
So I'm trying to think, Trying to think if we were to, you know, kind of organize collection in a different way. Let's say we had, let me think of one of the services we want to expand to. Let's say we wanted to do warehouses as an activity. I know that you're planning to develop in the future.
Okay.
Would you draw a national sample of warehouses from the headquarters that says, okay, I know exactly which companies I want to collect, and then send it out to the provinces where they would actually go collect those companies? Or do you instead have a system where you say, I know I want this many warehouses from this province, but the provincial office can decide which warehouses they actually go collect?
Actually, for the warehouse, we don't have a directory for the warehouse company, so we need to in-depth study first, maybe for the government officer. Yeah,
Do
maybe
you-
for the okay.
Do you have a business register?
We do not yet.
Andrew, can I make
Yes.
a comment?
Yes, please.
Yes, actually, we have a statistical business register, but we are afraid that we need to look through for this kind of warehousing. And at the moment, we are not yet collecting the information for warehousing prices, because we would like to concentrate with the already running for these SPPIs, like before Fendi said that we will focus for the transportation, accommodation, and also for the what is it? Telecommunication. But the first thing that I would like to ask you is about, in the previous slide, you said that for using direct pricing, say for the transportation, passenger transportation, additional characteristic needed, like type of customer, type of ticket, days in advance of flight and purchasing. In our case, we did not really collect this additional characteristic. We have a different additional characteristic. Is that okay that we collect a different characteristic to build our SCPI for the transportation?
So I'd maybe you can share the questionnaire you use or the characteristics you collect. I mean, typically it is important to specify those kinds of transaction terms because they affect the price, right? If someone purchases an airline ticket a week before the flight, they will likely get a different price than someone who purchases 2 months before the flight or the day before the flight.
Andrew, for the passenger transportation, we divide into the economy and business class, and then for each economy and business, we have a weekday and weekend, and then for the route, it's the one way. Before that, we ask the airline what is the three biggest for the route for
Right.
weekday. Yeah.
So
And
not
then
everyone who takes that flight on a Tuesday or Saturday pays the same price, right? Because it depends on when they buy it.
We in the form for the weekend we choose the second week. Yeah, the second week for the weekend.
So that's when the flight happens, but when did they buy the ticket?
The flight happened.
Great, I see.
And then we
questionnaire.
ask about the booking class. That's the booking class.
Maybe you can explain to Andrew about this questionnaire so Andrew can understand because some are in Bahasa.
This is our questionnaire, Andrew.
Great. Yes.
Itu siapa Mbak itu?
Yeah. I'm not sure how it works in Indonesia, if it is generally very simple prices. But I would guess for your large airline, you know, they probably don't have a single price. They have a price, even for something like an economy class ticket on the flights that occur on Tuesday for a particular route and class, right? They probably still have a whole lot of different prices they charge, depending on, did you buy it online? Did you buy it on their website? Did you buy it on an agent's website? Did you buy it on booking.com? Are you a business customer who has a preferred rate through a travel agent? But I don't know, are you seeing a lot of variability in these prices? You know, one thing I would say is that this looks like an initiation questionnaire. Like when you first collect the company, you want them to pick the routes, right? But then in all the other periods, we keep those routes constant, right? We're not changing them all the time. Is that right?
Yeah, it's initial.
Okay, great. Well, this looks good for an initial. You know, I don't think I think it's good. I think those additional characteristics could help you, but you know, again, if the companies are saying they're able to provide these prices, then it's okay. I think the worry is that, you know, maybe you have someone at the airline who gives you the price for someone who buys it on their website, and then the next month someone at the company starts taking over reporting, and then they give you the price of someone who buys it on booking.com. And now maybe you get a different price. But in general, you know, those, you know, that's why we try to specify some more characteristics about the transaction. But again, I think if it was problematic for you, you would see it in a lot of price volatility. And if you're not experiencing that, then, you know, it's okay. But the general idea is that I think it's helpful to specify those things because then you know exactly the constant quality transaction you're getting. And if you do a unit value, it's much simpler because then you don't have to worry about whether they bought it on booking.com or they bought it on the airline's website because it's all included in one price.
I'm sorry, Andrew. If we use unit value for the revenue, I mean, we have to know the revenue first, right? Who is the one who calculate the unit value? Is it the company or us? Because if it's us, so it means that we have to collect the revenue first, and I think the revenue is not all revenue they receive, but maybe there are some specific type of revenue that we have to collect in order to see the right price term, the right basic price that we need to collect, something like that.
Yeah, no, I think if this method, I don't think you have to use unit values. I think this method probably works great for you. If it's been successful, it seems great. So no, I guess what I was saying is that, you know, it's just a different approach, but the transaction prices, the fixed prices for repeated services, it looks really good. And hopefully the companies are, you know, can provide that information easily. And then, yeah, and I know you're already producing passenger transport, so I would assume, you know, everything is looking good and going well here. I think, you know, maybe there's a challenge with telecommunications because we got to see, is there a way that we can go back and make another attempt to collect data, maybe with a different approach where, you know, we try to work with the large telecom companies to see what kind of information they track and they might be willing to provide, as opposed to, you know, I don't know, maybe can you tell me a little bit about what your interactions were like with those companies? Was there personal visits, or was it, did you go with the spreadsheet and ask them to fill it out, or
From
what were those?
email.
All email.
For the questionnaire, but for the firstly for in-depth interview, we visit the company first, and then for the monthly data we got from email.
And when you visited those big telecom companies, were they willing to meet with you? Did they give you a time for a meeting? For
telcom, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, for in-depth, they're very welcome for the in-depth study, but for the monthly data, they can give us.
Okay, so you've already like selected the items you want prices for. You had the initial visit, and now they're just not giving you the updates.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Have you thought about maybe
Andrew?
doing enough? Yes.
Because of this situation that it's not easy to get the information from the big company for the telecommunication, is that okay that we look from their website? Because actually they provide more information about the services they provide, mostly I guess, that maybe we can use this information for our, just considering whether we can use it when we cannot get the information from the company.
Yes, I think that would be a great option. I know it's more time consuming for you because your staff need to go visit the website and do that all yourselves. But yes, I think that's a very smart approach if we're not able to get participation. I think also the one thing you want to be sure about is that you're getting not just the services for households, but also the services for businesses. I'm not sure if those are also available on the website. But yes, that makes sense. Or, another option would be to try to do another personal visit and just explain, like, we've not been receiving response. Is there something we can do to make this easier for you? That's another approach. But I think if we can't do that, then getting the prices online, I think would be a good approach. And probably would let that progress to the point where we could publish those telecommunications indexes. How about for freight transportation? It sounded like there were also some response challenges there.
For freight transportation, we have the data from the 2016, but for the freight air transport, we don't have the data. Like our calculation for the elementary aggregate, we use the short-term price relative. So our data is from 2016, but we don't have the data 2010. It's our wage until 2015. What about if for the freight transport, we use the price reference period for the short term, for the long term price? Is that okay? We combine about short term and long term price?
Not really, not in the same elementary aggregate. But I guess I'm confused. So you've collected prices from 2016.
Yeah.
Are those companies agreeing to give you,
Yeah.
price reports?
Yeah.
How often are you collecting them?
Monthly.
Okay. So I don't think we need to. So you could introduce the items into the aggregate at any time, right? You say you're using short-term relatives. So that means you can add items any month. Do you normally use long-term relatives?
We use a short-term price relative. So the current price is divided by the previous price.
So that means you can introduce new items at any time. I don't think you should need any historical price information to bring the items in to the calculation.
But the 100 index is the 2010.
You don't have to make it 100 equals 2010. Yeah, this is something I've talked to many countries about. The weights could be from 2010, but you could start the index in 2019. And this was actually very common in the US when we introduced indexes. We introduced indexes all the time. Again, at the elementary aggregate, it's all short-term relatives, so it's only comparing to the previous period. There's no comparison to 2010 anywhere in that index. You can start that index at 100 at any point. I would strongly encourage you not to feel like you could only start indexes at the every 10-year weight change, because it just limits your ability to expand coverage. I could show you an example maybe of a publication where different indexes start with different index reference periods.
So the index reference period, it's a quarter or a full years, it's annual for the index reference periods.
It can be, or it can be a month. I think they generally, for the CPI, they always advise to use a full year. I don't think it's quite as important for PPI. If you're going to use a full year as the index reference period, that means you'd have to collect 12 months of prices before you start, right? And then do an annual average. If that's your policy, I don't think it's necessary for a PPI.
So I think for the index reference period, especially for the freight transport, we can use the 2016 for the index reference periods for the 100.
I mean, you've been collecting prices every month for 4 years?
Yeah.
That's a lot of data.
Every month.
Yeah, we want to get that out. Share it. Share the love. Yes, I mean, absolutely. if you feel good about the historical data, you could go backwards. Or if you don't, if you think maybe we only have reliable data since 2019, whatever, I would encourage you to introduce those indexes at whatever point you think they're ready for publication.
So this that's okay. For the others category, we use the index reference period is 2010, and for the freight transport, we use the 29 for the index reference periods. That's okay. What do you mean?
Yes, I can show you a report I just did for the country of Georgia, where they also did not know that they could do that, and I encouraged them to do that. The key thing is that in the publication, you just need to state what is the index reference period for each component.
Okay.
That's my advice, and I give that to all countries.
Sorry, Andrew. If we use a different reference period, like 2000 and berapa tadi Pak Fendi? 9, yeah, or something like that. Is it okay with national account? I mean, the deflator that they use, is there like any problem could arise from that, or it's okay?
Well, I think we have some national accounts people on the call. I think as long as they know what the index reference period is, I mean, I'm not sure, are they getting the historical data now? I mean, I guess that the question is, you know, I would always think some data is better than no data. As long as they know the index reference period, I think they should be able to use it for at least the period starting when the data starts.
Okay, sorry, and I have a question about the freight air transport that have a very low response. If this the air freight transport is have a very low weight, I mean the share of its output on the activities is low, is it okay for us to just exclude it from the freight transport?
Yes. So you're talking about activities, detailed activities within freight transport, like maybe
Yes.
inland water or something?
Air,
or,
yeah, particularly or air transport.
Absolutely. This was always another challenging area because there's no set rule. I could tell you about a practical rule that we used in the United States. We said if we had 80% coverage of the activities within an aggregate, that we would consider it ready for publication. So that means as long as we covered 80% of the activities within freight transport, we would put out freight transport. Sometimes it's just not worth it to collect those activities that contribute very little to the aggregate. But again, the key thing is going to be communicating that to users. Anything about the data, you just need to communicate it to someone like the national account so that they understand what's in this data and what's not.
And for the 80% you mentioned earlier, is that any like theoretical background or just, yeah, just?
Nope.
Oh.
Nope. No theoretical backgrounds. You know, I think national accountants are also used to dealing with partial coverage and having to make the best use of the data that is available. There's no theoretical background for that. And that's not an international rule. There's no international rule I'm sure there's not, because if there was, I would use it. But basically, I've talked to many compilers of PPI, and you know, again, it depends on what your level of aggregation is. So I'd have to check the ISIC. You follow ISIC, right?
Yeah.
So I need to just check the ISIC. Maybe for tomorrow, we'll list out the ISIC, and you can show me what you'd have to cover. But our general rule was if we would publish a 4-digit if we covered 80% of the activities for the 6 digits within it.
Another question, Andrew. So we cannot aggregate into the 2-digit ISIC because it's different index reference period. For the passenger, we use the 2010 index reference period, but for the freight, let's say we use 2019. So we cannot aggregate for the 2-digit ISIC.
So so your issue is not the different index reference period. Your issue is that your current aggregate did not include freight transportation, and then at some point it will include freight transportation, right? That's something that happens as you expand coverage of the services PPIs. So if you always had to have data back to when your aggregate started, you could, even if you wanted to add more activities 10 years from now, you'd still have to go all the way back to 2010. You have to evaluate how much the aggregate changes with the addition of the new services. And again, it'll help me. I can provide some recommendations on this if we know exactly how much freight transportation represents of the 2-digit based on your 2010 data. But I think you're probably going to have to start a new aggregate for freight transportation. Transportation that now includes freight. Right, that's why we use this 80% rule, because we'd say, look, if we already covered 80% of the aggregate, then we could add additional services and we don't need to start a new index. But I'm guessing freight transportation, if you include all the things that are included in that 2-digit, you're also talking about support activities, warehousing, right?
Not yet about warehousing and support.
I know, but if we think about activities that are within the 2-digit for transportation, I think it's, right? Aren't they all in the same 2-digit classification? Warehousing.
For the warehousing is 52, and for the postal and courier is 53. It's different 2 digits.
Okay, different 2 digits. But what about at the 1-digit? Do you publish an aggregate for the 1-digit for the letter?
Yes. For the
so
category.
What are you going to do there when you? So basically what I'm trying to say is that it's normal as you expand coverage to have to adjust your aggregates. And the key thing is to communicate with your data users, right? Normally, so when I talked about this 80% rule, we wouldn't have published an index for all transportation at the 1-digit level until we had 80% coverage. I'm not sure if you do or you don't now, right? Because if you consider all these other activities like warehousing and support services, which sometimes are large, we could look at the national accounts data and see what your coverage is now. But as you add additional coverage, at some point your aggregate's going to be significantly different than it was before you covered those activities. And then you're going to have to change. You're going to probably have to create a new series. Or that's what most countries do in that situation. And you can explain to users, look, this series covered these transportation activities, right? Not everything that's within the 1-digit. It only included passenger transport for this time period. And then after we have a new index that now includes all these services. Then the next question is, do you link them? And I would advise not to link them because they're so fundamentally different. These are interesting questions. Maybe we could talk more about those issues tomorrow. I think tomorrow maybe we do more of a discussion like this, maybe, and rather than so much slides, right? We could discuss, and maybe I'll try to do some research on the specific situation, and maybe I'll prepare some discussion topics.
Yeah, maybe we can discuss. We have a small group discussion tomorrow about the telecommunication and freight, especially.
Yes, yes, we'll stick on those topics. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe it is enough for today.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on and
Is
answer
there
any.
anything else?
May
Well,
I ask, but Debbie, Andrew, may I ask for you?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, Pak Sugi.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. You very detailed and complete about your explanation about the air transport. Regarding the air transport, in particular passenger air transport, we know that some aircraft or airline have detailed type of specification like regular route and regular schedule. Yeah, I think it's as like in the ISIC and the CPC ISIC SMS. And then the other, we have information about regarding the specification of the services, in particular the prices of the services. So we know that mostly the aircraft have type of the classes like maybe first class, business class, and maybe economic class. Okay. Regarding the two conditions, I would like to know how Andrew in US maybe have the best experience. What ideal the calculation of the index, we must calculate the index in particular in the elementary of aggregate index, must use the equal weights or maybe not equal weight. Example, maybe from the type of the classes, some cases very difficult to get the review. Yeah, maybe how much the review from the business class for the first class. In theoretical, maybe it's easy. Maybe in the manual there are but in practice in Indonesia, sometimes when we go to the company Garuda Airline example, not easy to get the data. What your experience in maybe in US in Bureau of Labor Statistics in America? What the calculation of the SPPA must be consider the revenue to wages, equal wage, or maybe unequal. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, so in the specific example you referenced where you're talking about business class versus economy class, we would include that in the same category. They would be separate items, but they would be within the same category. So we wouldn't have to get separate weights. So in the US, the categories for air transportation were international and domestic. But then within those categories, we would select different items for business class or economy class, but they would all come from the same category of either international or domestic. So the weight we would collect would be international or domestic, and then we could split that equally amongst all the items we would collect. So we didn't have specific weights on how much was business class versus economy. I hope that answered your question. I mean, that's why it's very important to think about what are those product categories that you use as your list. You know, I showed for telecom the CPC categories of carrier service and internet services. I think you want to use product categories that match the records that the companies keep in Indonesia, right? So if they talk about you know, internet and programming and phone, then use those words, say that, you know. We spent a lot of effort on talking to companies to try to ask these questions in a way that aligns with their record-keeping practices.
Yeah.
So I know we've reached time. For anyone who's asked a question or has a question, I can stay on. I know you might have other things you can do or that you have to do or want to do. You have jobs to do. But for me, it's nighttime, so I can stay on and answer questions for anyone who's interested. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, no problem.
Andrew,
So,
I want to. Oh, okay.
Oh iya, oke. Silakan Bu Esther dulu.
In my provincial office, the headquarters of the train for the freight transport and also passengers is being collected from the office, the capital office of the train company. But every time we just ask for the data for every 3 months, and they give us the list of the prices like the Mr. Pandy just now show you. They just give the data almost the same for every month, because to change the tariff is not as easy as like the private company, because the train company belong to the government in Indonesia. So is that okay? And also the tariff only change during holiday, and usually in 1 month, for example, like New Year's or Christmas or Idul Fitri, only that time the tariff for the passenger will change, but the tariff for the freight is going to be the same for the whole year. Is it okay then to do that? We don't ask the revenue, maybe how many tons per year or per month they have the contract with the company or something like that. Okay, thank you.
Yes, no, thank you for the question. I think that's very similar to the situation of the subway in Bangkok that I talked about. If they have a standard price list and everyone pays that price, then I think you could just get that off the website. You know, if it's public, or you could absolutely collect that, and it's no problem. That's you probably don't even need to bother the train company, right? If you know that the price is that, and you could keep it the same until the next period when it gets updated. So in that situation, yes, that is absolutely okay, if that's really what everyone is paying.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to try to answer some of these questions that are in the chat. Like I said, I know we're over time, so if everyone has to go, that's fine. But for anyone who wants to stay, I could try to answer these as quickly as I can. Just got to make sure I get them.
Yeah, okay, maybe one more question in the question answer column from Mr. Bayu.
Oh,
yeah, Bayu Wicaksono, about how PPI services data is collected in US.
Is data collected by internal staff for balance? So in the US, the data was collected with data collectors who were employees of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the statistics agency. So no outsourcing. It was all done by employees, but they were employees in our field offices, similar to provincial offices. But all the training would be done by the headquarters staff. We always we made it so that the headquarters staff developed the expertise about the methodology and the procedures, and they would be responsible for training the data collectors on those procedures so they could go visit the companies and make the successful visits. When the enterprise couldn't give us price data we need with preferred method, who made the decision to change the method of pricing? So that's a great question. So when we would provide procedures to the data collectors, we would often say, for this type of service, this is the preferred type of price. If you're unable to get that, then you could collect this as the second best. And if you're not able to collect that, we'd say don't collect any other kind of price because we don't think it's acceptable. We would describe all of that in the procedures that we would provide to the data collectors. So the headquarters staff thought about all those situations and provided that information to the field collectors. I could give you some examples. I could maybe post on the website some examples of what those procedures look like and what those documents look like. Is there any seasonal effect that we have to consider in the process of data collection, data processing, index calculation? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, you know when your holiday periods are, and so you don't try to schedule company visits during those times. You should have an advanced calendar of when you're going to produce the data, disseminate the data, as I'm sure you do, so you can plan around holiday periods. But that's all I'm aware of for seasonal situations. Okay. Now I could try to answer some of these questions in the chat. I'll take them as they came. Let me see. Let me see if there are any others.
I think there is no more questions.
Oh, good.
Or is there any question, Bapak Ibu? If there is no question, maybe I think it is enough for this section today.
Great. Yes, I look forward to talking with the smaller group of compilers tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can have a small group discussion tomorrow.
Great.
So thank you, Andrew, for the presentation and for the answer. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's course. Thank you so much. And we will have a break until 1 p.m. And then we will continue our agenda at 1 p.m. So thank you, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Andrew. See you tomorrow.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bisa live ya berarti ya.
Silakan live meeting nanti jam 1 gabung lagi ya Bapak Ibu.
Iya, Bu.
Jangan lupa.
Iya, Bu.
Terima kasih Bu Debi.
Yang telat ditinggal.
Apa, Bu?
Silakan makan siang dulu. Mohon maaf untuk yang Indonesia Timur.
Bu Indri kalau telat ditinggal, Bu Indri.
Bu Indri jangan ketinggalan lagi ya Bu.
Barita. Bang Leo itu hati-hati Bang Leo, ada yang teriak-teriak.